Our agenda another hour and a half agenda in an hour, because everyone's going to be incredibly concise in their comments. Administrative business, we have a calendar, which is really, the font, I swear, keeps getting smaller. I know that Heath was postponed as an open forum because of the weather, and so when that gets rescheduled, can you just ping the group?
We will. We're in
Okay.
process now.
Great, thank you. And then are there others outstanding you'll ping us with?
Yes.
Okay. Any questions or additions to the calendar? Assuming Sunday is the public library midwinter mingle, assuming it doesn't get snowed out. But it's a great event. It's a lot of fun. Anything else?
I think there's a STEPS board meeting this week coming up, right?
It's rescheduled for next Wednesday, I believe.
Oh, did it get rescheduled?
It's the 11th.
Oh, I thought it was this week coming up.
That is this week coming.
That is with
All
you.
of that,
Today is Thursday.
violently
That's
agreeing.
right.
Excellent.
Thank you very much. All right.
The only other thing I will note is that the selectmen have indicated that they are still on track to vote on a ballot question for the override next Tuesday night. So pop your popcorn or show up with us. Consent agenda. There are 2 items on the consent agenda, the past record and a field trip. Do I have a motion? Ms. Cox? Ms. Stone, seconded. All those in favor? All those in favor? Thank you. It is unanimous. Thank you. And there's one field trip that we did not put into the consent agenda. There's just a couple notes about it. Do you want to say something?
I do. So you have a request for out-of-state field trip for the Sojourn experience, which has been offered at Brookline High School for the past 3 years. The advisors, both new and experienced, inadvertently neglected to submit the field trip request form for this year's trip, which will take place on February 13th and 19th. They submitted the attached request on February 4th, and I'm recommending that you approve this trip as part of tonight's agenda. Since you came, Mr. Rothstein, do you want to say a word about the?
Sure.
You have to come up here to do that, if you don't mind.
I don't know. Hi. TV. Yes, awesome. It's about time. My name is Nick Rothstein. I teach at Brookline High School. The trip that we are taking the students this year is called Sojourn to the Past. It has been, this will be, I think, the 4th year in the mainstream they've been doing, but I know that other teachers in the Opportunity for Change program have done it prior to this. And so it's actually been around for a long time. I'll keep it short. Again, Sojourn to the Past, a nonprofit organization that takes kids from high schools around the country, takes them to many of the important civil rights sites throughout Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Arkansas. They've shortened it this year. It's only Georgia and Atlanta, so it went from a 10-day trip to a 7-day trip. Anyways, I apologize for the late notice on this. Again, we thought that the approval was sort of this, once it's done once, it's sort of this ongoing binding thing. And so that's what, it was more or less told to us that was the way, so we never thought of it again when we signed up for this. Anyways, obviously when we found out, we scrambled and put it together. But we're taking off next Friday, and we are looking forward to it. Kids are excited, done a lot of fundraising. It's been a lot of work. Had an outstanding dinner the other night at the Village Smokehouse, some great speakers, some incredible speakers that we didn't realize we had them on our hands, but people who had really gone through this experience. Anyways, so we'd love to have your approval.
And our thanks to Ms. Coyne, who actually caught this, Mr. Khan, off of your report, I believe, at the last meeting.
Really? You guys have tackled us at the airport, and that's probably what happened.
And
Good. It's good.
so we'll remember that the approval's an annual.
I promise I'll make sure I'll
Thank you very
trumpet this
much.
nice and loud
I
next
appreciate that.
next
Thank
year
you.
for sure, and the rest.
So that's our recommendation. Thank you for being here.
All right, our student rep adding value all the time, Ms. Coyne's tireless detail orientation. Do I have a motion? Dr. Jackson, seconded by Mr. Glover. Is there a discussion?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So I would like to, because I think people forget from year to year, maybe we could send out a notice to all staff about field trips and the procedures, in terms of when you need to get a request into us so
So
that
we've
people
actually-
don't end up.
We've actually approached that in a different way. we've encouraged the headmaster, since most of the trips of this type come from the high school, and they've indicated they will do this to make sure that they are logging trips and providing those reminders for people who do that. It's really a building level responsibility to make sure those trips are in, and so we've had those conversations with the headmaster already.
Okay, and so with the elementary principals on their 8th grade trips too?
Right, although
That
yes,
seems to be under
we-
control. I
we
don't remember
right.
getting it at the last minute.
No,
but-
we don't, although they tend to have a process in place. Fewer number of trips, it's easier to manage.
Sure. Okay, thank you.
Further discussion? Dr. Jackson?
Is this also a trip where we get the pleasure of hearing about it at the school committee, or could we hear about it?
We
We have in the past.
Or some forum to hear about it, even if it's
have
not
a few
special
times, is that
thing.
right?
Normally what happens is.
Can you come up to the microphone? I'm really sorry.
Normally what happens is, after the trip, there is what they call, we get the students together to do what they call an action plan. And again, it's where the students can make some sort of contribution, really locally around here, revolving around civil rights. Certainly what we can do is when we organize the kids and start thinking about this, we have and come and at least present it
That'd be great.
to you all. And we can make that happen.
And I
Thank
think,
you.
I think it would be great for them to share with us what they're learning. I mean,
Absolutely.
what the value of this trip is for them would be great.
Sure.
Thank you.
Again, all right.
We have in the
a lot.
past, we actually got slideshows in the past. We got we got pictures. There were all kinds of fun things.
That's right. I can try and make that happen.
Not to raise the bar.
That's right. All right.
You'll get that requested on time in the future, won't you?
Of course, that was before everybody had a video on their phone.
Actually, there's no phones allowed on this trip.
No phones allowed on the trip. All right, well, okay. Any other discussion? All those in favor? It is unanimous. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great trip.
Thank you very much. Is anything going to be signed, or is it just?
We'll get something back to you. Great, thank you. Thanks for coming out.
Subcommittee reports. Mr. Chang, Finance, recognizing that you are on the docket again in a little bit. to talk
Well,
about the
basically, I was just
second
going to say,
quarter.
we're going to be discussing the second quarter reports a little bit later on this evening.
And our next meeting is?
Yes. Our next meeting is this coming Monday. I believe that's, what, the 9th?
Yes.
Starting at 8:30.
We're having the executive session.
Do I need to say that?
Sure, go right ahead.
And we also do have an executive session in that finance subcommittee meeting.
All right. Capital improvements. Mr. Pollak.
The Capital Improvement Subcommittee has a meeting scheduled for this coming Tuesday evening at 5 o'clock, to be followed by a meeting of the town's Building Commission at 6 o'clock, and we will bring you the news from both of those meetings next week.
Thank you, Mr. Pollak. Ms. Cox, for additions.
Sure. So the Devotion Building Committee has had 2 meetings since our last time. On January 29th, we had a community meeting at the Devotion Multipurpose Room, where the architects presented the floor plans and the schematic design that may eventually be submitted to the MSBA. That will be voted on February 19th at the next Devotion Building Committee meeting. The purpose of the community meeting was to solicit input from the community. We heard a great deal, in addition to the architects presenting the schematic design. Joe Connolly, who's the interim principal at Devotion, talked about the process and how closely the architects have worked with the staff and how impressed he's been in the many projects that he's conducted, that this was an unparalleled level of cooperation and collaboration and listening on the part of the architects. And Dr. Lupini also spoke to the assembled about what a possible phasing and transition plan might look like, with the understanding that a lot of that information is yet to come, and that we would know more in early March, and he would return to talk more about that. I would say that the reaction of the community meeting, of the community at that meeting, seemed to be satisfaction with the floor plans, so we had very little comment or question about the floor plans. There's a lot of question about the phasing and the transition, and therefore they will welcome Dr. Lupini's return visit. There was a little bit of consternation about the number, and we had to do a little bit of explaining about the number of students, really reflecting the fact that Devotion has been planned in this new project as a 5-section K through 8 school, and that the numbers that were arrived at were a calculation by MSBA standards of what a class size would look like at different grades, and when you totaled those, you got to 1010, which was the number that many people at Devotion had held in their minds, but they hadn't also factored in the 2 preschool, pre-K classrooms, which are certainly something that the community welcomes and wants to have. So I think that was a very helpful explanation to understand how that number had been arrived at. We had another Devotion Building Committee meeting today where we got another update on the project. There wasn't a lot of change in, I don't even remember, I don't think we looked at floor plans today.
The change was in the number.
The change was in the numbers, and we received a cost estimate that showed a rising cost to the project, and the committee made it very clear that we want to contain rising costs. The architects and the owner's project manager, Tony Quigley, have already started to come up with some ideas of how the project might be value engineered to keep those numbers lower. And we are going to have a couple of meetings in order to continue to look at that. So on February 11th, we are having an architectural review subcommittee of the Devotion Building Committee. They were originally supposed to meet last week, but it was snowed out. So they'll be meeting on the 11th, and they'll be looking at those questions. The Site Planning Committee is also meeting on the morning of the 11th. And then their recommendations and suggestions will come back to the full Devotion Building Committee on the 19th, when they're hoping that we will be able to vote the schematic design so that it can be submitted to the MSBA by March 11th, which is our deadline.
Mr.
Thank you. I just had a quick question. I know that there is a date certain by which the number, whatever the cost estimate is on that date, is the cost against which the MSBA determines its reimbursement. The rate has been determined, but the amount is based on a figure. And even if we go above that figure in the future, they still only reimburse up to that figure. When does that number happen?
That's the funding agreement that gets made between the town and MSBA, and then also, the other side of that agreement is what town meetings vote. And currently, that's scheduled for the June 3rd MSBA meeting.
Okay,
That's when it gets baked in. And then if they're consistent, if MSBA is consistent with its pattern of last year, which it may or may not be, that might also be the meeting at which they would consider the reimbursement rate. So they can take it up on an annual basis if they choose, and if there's evidence in the marketplace with recently bid and contracted school projects that show new numbers. So they could take them both up on the same day. They could take them up in whatever order they chose to take it up on their agenda.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Any other questions? Great. All right, curriculum, Ms. Chalupsky.
Curriculum actually had the school improvement reports from 2 schools today, earlier at 4:45. 3 schools, sorry, I can't count. One of them had to do with numeracy, actually, and being able to count. That was our BEEP program that came and spoke. They spoke about how they want to improve numeracy in with preschool children, and some of the professional development that they plan on doing. And other people from the committee can chime in if I'm leaving anything else out. We also had Mary Brown come and speak from Baker School on their school. Each schools spoke about one small aspect of their school improvement plan, because in a half an hour of presentation and questions together, you can't dig very deep into anything. But I think we certainly got a flavor of the schools and their ways of approaching school improvement and the areas that they felt were important for their particular schools. Just one second. So Baker School's area of focus was on special education and the gap in their performance of special education students versus typically developing students at Baker. And they decided to try and approach it in a very collaborative manner with all their teachers being part of the process and looking at how to get a better working together of special education teachers and regular education teachers, and in order to make that all work better for children. It's been a 2-year process, some of it delayed because of our new evaluation process that came into being during this time period. And as far as it's gone to date, I think the principal feels very, very positive about the results and plans to continue this throughout this year and next year. Rick Rogers from the Lawrence School came and spoke about habits of mind and how to affect basically school-based change over time, and he's working on it in many different ways, but similar to the Baker School and dividing up into smaller groups and getting people to talk with one another more than being talked at. And I think he's also finding that this has been actually quite exciting for the staff and the leadership there, because people are choosing with their feet to attend these and be part of this process. So I'm not sure if there's anything else that I'm leaving out, but that's what we did today. Tomorrow morning, we have a very busy curriculum schedule, actually. We're meeting at 8:30 to have a report from the Enrichment and Challenge program review. Huh?
Perfect. Thank you. All right, government relations, Ms. Stone. Nothing to report. Policy review, Ms. Cox, you get a little bit of extra time today because you've been so hard at work up until this meeting.
Exactly. We have to prove that the policy subcommittee has been working hard, so.
Getting input from the public on your work, it's so exciting.
Yes, and we've heard from the public, which has been very exciting. I hope everyone had a chance to read, I think it's now 16 pages of our new J7 policy. Our previous J7 was 43 pages long, with many sections predating ed reform of 1993, so it was certainly time for revision. The impetus for this revision at this time came from the state legislature's passage of Chapter 222, an act relative to student access to educational services and exclusion from school, which passed in the state in 2012 but took effect in July of 2014. And this law was motivated by the concern that many students across the state, and disproportionately students belonging to racial minorities, were being excluded from school for minor infractions. The law responded by, number one, distinguishing between serious and less serious offenses and imposing greater requirements for school administration to exclude students from school for more minor offenses. So in our policy, you might have seen a reference to 37H, 37H and a half, and 37H and 3/4, which led us to dub it the Hogwarts policy. 37H and 3/4 is a category that incorporates any offense that doesn't involve possession of weapons or drugs, assault on educational staff, or felony charges. That's that more minor offenses category. The second thing the law did was to require districts to continue to provide educational services to students who have been excluded from school. So if you have been suspended or expelled, the district still has a responsibility to provide you with an education, which is something that the school department, I think, is now putting together. You may remember we passed an interim policy in our first sessions in September of this year, while the policy subcommittee took up a revision of the existing policy. And through the fall, with the assistance of the school department, and particularly Dr. Schmuckler, and town council's office, particularly Associate Town Council Patty Correa, we've revised the existing student discipline policy to comply with the new legal requirements. We've removed outdated codes of conduct for the K-8s in the high school. Those are more properly found in each school's code of conduct, generally in their student handbook, where they can be revised in a more timely and appropriate way than the unwieldy nature of coming to the district's policy subcommittee. In keeping with the law, we have prioritized the message that unless a principal determines that failure to impose a long-term suspension or expulsion from school would have a substantial detriment on the general welfare of the school, long-term suspension and expulsion should not be used until alternatives like mediation, conflict resolution, restorative justice, and other evidence-based strategies have been tried. We've focused on student discipline in this section, with an emphasis on ensuring the rights of due process and notifying parents or guardians in a meaningful way, including the necessity of translating notices into the primary language of the home in a district that has a growing population of non-native English speakers. We have added provisions for the opportunity to make academic progress during a period a student has been removed from the classroom or school, and charged the school department to support principals in the development of education service plans to address those needs. 4 sections of the existing policy will be removed within our policy manual. There's a section on student demonstrations and strikes, which has become more timely, but dates back to 1971. That will be moved within Section J, and we'll look at it in conjunction with our next topic, student attendance, as the focus of the section as it currently exists in the policy manual is largely on whether participation in such strikes constitutes an excused or unexcused absence. So it made sense to maybe look at it while we were looking at attendance. Student drug abuse, which is a section which dates from 1970, needs to be revised. There's some overlap with the changes that we made in J7 in terms of possession, but the focus on students' well-being and care fits more properly into a different section of our policy manual. The police-school agreement dating from 1989 is no longer reflective of arrangements in place. We're awaiting more direction from the state on the requirements it will expect with the passage last year of Chapter 284, an act relative to the reduction of gun violence, which talks about school resource officers. Without further guidance from the state, it seems we'll need to wait to revise this section. And finally, there's a section on physical restraint of students, which may be more recent in people's memories because it came before this committee in a revised form 2 years ago. It will now more aptly be moved to Section E. It's a student well-being issue. It's not a disciplinary issue, and we're going to move it where it's more appropriate. So we have been working on this revised draft of J7. We have put this revised draft policy on our webpage for public comment. We did it at the end of last week, and a big thanks to Ms. Coyne for making that happen. We advertised it through a notice to PTO updates and the Town Meeting Members Association listserv. And we have received some suggestions that it would be useful to explicitly call for the inclusion of parents in principals' hearings for Section 37H offenses, require the notification of parents for contemplated in-school suspensions on 37H offenses. We are currently calling for reasonable efforts, and to consider imposing timeframes in all points of the process. So we were very happy to see that people saw the posting of our revised draft and took the time to respond because they cared about the issue. And our subcommittee is scheduled to meet on Tuesday, February 10th, where we'll consider all the comments in reaction to the first reading draft before we bring the policy back to you for a vote. But of course, you also have the opportunity to make suggestions and comments based on our first reading draft, and I will look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Well, before I open it up, just a thank you to Ms. Cox for shepherding us so ably through all of this. I know you worked closely with legal counsel, with the superintendent, with lots of people and senior staff, and Karen in particular, I believe, Dr. Schmuckler. So thank you for shepherding everyone and mastering it. And thank you also again, once again, for this process of reaching out to the public and letting them know what we're talking about and soliciting input. I know it's something that we've wanted to do for a while, and you finally got the mechanics to work. So we're just very excited that people are responding. So thank you for that. Questions or thoughts on this? We've been through it. There are lots of. Right. Yes. Well, I have to say, what was it? There was the 3/4 was the thing that struck me in particular, prompting the Hogwarts. Yeah, what is 3/4 of an H? We don't know what that is. Prompting the Hogwarts Express comment. So.
Yes, and we're waiting for 37 7/8.
7/8, exactly. This feels like an ECS problem.
I'm sorry, I should have said this prior. I do expect that whatever you take action on, whether it's this as written now or whether there are modifications next Tuesday, I do believe we'll be back at this policy within the next year. It probably, with such a major revision, it probably doesn't surprise people to know that a variety of associations, including MASS, have filed what I'll call clarifying legislation on this issue, with some issues, some of which I pointed out in the subcommittee meeting, that have, you see how these things begin to play out, and people say, was that really what was intended here? So there are a number of those things that are sort of in the queue and in the legislature now. So I think we'll be discussing this policy for some time. So.
All right, Ms. Gatto.
I basically have a question. Under the procedures, the definition and definitions, there's a section that talks about assault on a principal, teacher, teacher's aide, or other educational staff on school premises. And I was wondering about this because it seems to me that there are at least two groups left out. One has to do with not necessarily educational staff, but building staff. Suppose there's an assault on the custodian or on a cafeteria worker. Also, there are often parents present at school-sponsored events. It could be a field trip or a dance or something, and if a student assaults that parent, would that not result in an expulsion if it is at a school event? That's not included in this definition.
But this definition, I believe, I don't know the answer to your question.
From the statute.
This definition is specifically from the statute.
Okay, because it seems to me that then is lacking in the statute. It's a fairly limited list of assaults.
So am I correct? I'll look at the two more experts on this. So so that would constitute a 37H and 3/4 offense, correct? Yes, by statute. By statute, you couldn't call it a 37H offense. It would have to be a 37H and 3/4, and you would deal with that situation according to those rules, if that makes any sense at all, because it did to me, so.
It's all right.
Right, I feel like these are the kinds of things that seem arcane until they happen, and then all of a sudden, people get very interested in where every comma is. So all jokes aside, this is really important. So thank you for pushing this forward and making it so coherent.
And which is why I wouldn't be surprised if we're back again.
Right.
And if it needs to change, it
Exactly.
should respond to practical realities, so.
We've been through that 3 times with the bullying legislation, so it's the way this works.
And hopefully arriving at a better policy.
Right.
All right, then. So that was our
Great
first
job.
reading. We will have a second reading 1 week from tonight, and a vote, hopefully. Okay.
And then for the second first reading draft, I'm going to turn over to Ms. Stone, who knows this policy so much better.
Thank you, Ms. Cox. So this is not fundamentally a substantive revision. We revised this policy because we became aware in looking at one section of it that it had not been updated subsequent to the decisions and the votes that we made off of the ad hoc enrollments group committee in 2012. And so what you have in front of you is essentially a reorganization of the language, and in some cases, some updating of the language and clarifying, but there is effectively no substantive change. So what did we change? The name of the policy, J1E, used to be assignment of students to schools / buffer zones. It's now assignment of students to schools, and it has several subsections. The first one on open enrollment, the substance, again, is completely unchanged. I believe even the language is unchanged, but we did delete some procedural notes that had been in the policy before about the section of the policy being suspended briefly and why, and none of that. That's all in historical record. It's all in minutes. It doesn't need to be in the policy manual, and so that was taken out. Out-of-district transfer requests was not changed at all. That's Section 2. Section 3, which was always on buffer zones, essentially we organized what's here into 4 different categories to make it easier for the public to have access to the policy that pertains to whatever they're interested in. So what used to be just one big thing on buffer zones that was largely about the establishment of buffer zones is now in 4 sections: establishment, B, family preference and sibling assignment, C, review of the policy on buffer zones and the structure of buffer zones, and D, public access to the information. And again, what you have in front of you in the revision is mostly, again, with some clarifying language, but mostly what was there before, just organized for better access to the information and updated after what we did in 2012, and in particular reaffirming that the periodic review, the promise to periodic review was something that we added when we changed the buffer zones in 2012, and so it is built in here as a regular part of the policy, that the policy on buffer zones will be regularly reviewed. A number of things can trigger that review, including, for example, a large shift in enrollment due to new developments. It's not the new development itself that triggers the review, it is the increase in enrollments on an individual school. So to a few parents who we've heard from the Baker District, where they are understandably concerned about the future, should the Hancock Village 40B development finally occur at some point. And we have tried to reassure, I think a number of them were disappointed. You may have seen the letters that they wrote if they got copied to the committee. They were disappointed, I think, in seeing that we were reviewing this, that there was not something more specific about putting something like a Hancock Village development into a buffer zone. But that's not really a policy revision. That would be, if we were going to do that, we would consider it as a part of the review of those buffer zones. And again, typically a large increase in enrollment, which I would expect, I think we all expect, would come from the eventual development of Hancock Village, would trigger a review. So just to reassure people that it's not that any given piece of land or development or set of residences is protected from being a buffer zone or not protected from being a buffer zone. Everything is equal. The buffer zones are created. We don't like them. They're not a good thing for neighborhood schools to start divvying things up. So the review is basically to look for opportunities to reduce the reliance on buffer zones when we don't need them. So that's just to clarify that one important piece for people who are looking at that particular element. And again, I regret that in the revision, the first reading revision in front of you, Section 4 of the assignment of students to schools got lopped off. That's the temporary relocation of students and/or classrooms, which we voted just 2 years ago. And that still will be in the policy. It still belongs right there. It just didn't get included in the piece that got circulated to you. So, but it was not changed in any way. And that is the revision.
All right. Again, this one has been through lots and lots of discussion. Ms. Charlowski.
I'm not going to discuss it more.
Well, that's okay.
However, what I would like to request, so that we can come into the 21st century, is that there be a link from D to the actual map of the buffer zones, and with the notation that as of some date, these are the buffer zones, or somehow, or that, well, if it's a link, it doesn't matter, because they get, as it gets updated, it would be the.
There is a link embedded.
Oh, there is?
The map is available online, I believe.
It says it's online.
But it also gives the,
No, but
oh, no,
somebody's-
we took the URL out because URLs can sometimes change, and you don't want to send people, the policy manual should not be sending people to dead links, for example, but we can certainly, in the online version of the policy manual, we can put a quick link into it.
That's what I meant.
Right. Yeah, we can
That's exactly
we
what I
can
meant.
certainly do that.
All righty, this is a first reading. We will vote on it next Thursday night, hopefully, in a second reading. Additional liaisons. Oh, sorry, something else on policy?
Oh, just so I can reiterate, so our next policy subcommittee meeting is on February 10th, and at that point, the draft revisions will come down off the webpage because it's a 10-day comment period. So if you are going to make a comment, please make it before the 10th. Thank you.
All righty. Additional liaisons. Dr. Jackson.
So I attended the Special Education Parent Advisory Council meeting on January 23rd with Dr. Schmuckler, who I'm going to turn to when I forget something important, because I did have to leave a little early. The content focused primarily on two topics. I think it's Terry Hauser, do I have her name right? Hauserman, from, who is responsible for the extended year program for students with IEPs, talked about what the plans were for this summer, what options were available, presented a schedule, and shared that information. Dr. Smuckler also talked about the relationship we have with Smart Summers that helps fill out the day, because a lot of these extended year programs are not full-day programs. So that was one part of the content, and I believe CPAC will have the information on their website, and it may also be on the school departments as well. Dr. Schmuckler then, and this is when I left, so if there's anything you want to add, you should jump in, shared the findings from the comprehensive review that we had shared with us as a school committee previously, but specifically around special education, and shared that with the group. And I don't know if there are any comments or topics you want to raise from that conversation since I wasn't there. Great. And the next meeting is February 27th at 8:30. That's it.
All righty. Any other liaisons? Seeing none, we will move on to our next agenda item, which is public comment. Do we have anyone signed up? No one has signed up for public comment? Is there anyone here who wishes to make public comment? All right. Seeing none, superintendent's report. Dr. Lupini.
Thank you very much. You have a copy of the report, I believe. We're going to start by talking about 9C budget cuts. Governor Baker released his plan to balance the FY 2015 state budget earlier this week. I'm having trouble keeping track of weeks right now. And implemented as part of that a number of 9C cuts, which are unilateral cuts he has the ability to make to specific programs. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. Headlines in the media that continue to credit governors with not making cuts to local aid when they are making 9C cuts are at best misleading. At best misleading. This governor has gotten credit, like the governor before him, for sparing local aid in his reduction plan, and he has done no such thing. There are significant cuts to our budget that were made in November by then Governor Patrick and by Governor Baker in this budget. I'm going to ask Mr. Rowe to come forward and talk specifically about a few areas of our budget that have been impacted by the 9C cuts. They are Metco, which was also reduced in Governor Patrick's reductions in November. kindergarten expansion and circuit breaker in particular. And in addition, there are reductions in the Department of Early Education and Care that could have an impact, and again, could have an impact on our FY15 plan. Mr. Rowe, I've asked to do this tonight, even though we have very incomplete information right now. What we know are the totality of these reductions. We have not received notification of a specific amount attributable to Brookline, but Mr. Rowe agreed to be able to try to provide you with some estimates of where we may stand in some of these areas. Mr. Rowe.
Thank you. So the numbers are roughly the following, and what is really going on is the Governor Patrick made some recommended reductions back in the fall, and Governor Baker has now added on to those in certain cases. So, for instance, these are the total numbers, so that when we look at the METCO program, the total cut that's being recommended between the two is about 6.5%. And if you apply that percentage to our allocation, which is in the $1.3 million range, that would be a cut of somewhere in the $80,000 range. So we would expect to see a number somewhere in that range. The one to the kindergarten program is more significant. I think the total state appropriation is about $23 million, and Governor Baker's cut is $5 million, and that's on top of about a $300,000 cut from the previous governor. So that's about a 22% reduction. So that, again, if you look at the impact on Brookline, it could be in the $75,000 range. And finally, the third that would directly impact our budget would be circuit breaker. It's a much lower percentage, only about a 1.5% cut to the account, although the appropriation is much larger. So again, that would probably impact us in the $25,000 to $30,000 range. So together, those could potentially have a significant impact. And then the point you referred to about early education and care, while we don't receive those funds directly, some of that money flows through families who may be using vouchers and other sources to access our early education program. So if it has an impact on our early education program, it'll have an impact on that revolving fund, so there could be additional impact. So those are in broad strokes the numbers. And we didn't incorporate those to the report we'll get to in a few minutes, which is the second quarter report. This is news that really came to us after we put that together. So those would be adjustments that we'll have to make as we go forward.
So, thank you, Mr. Rowe. In a meeting with the commissioner yesterday, MASS officers met with the commissioner yesterday, Jeff Wolfson, who tends to be our deputy commissioner, who is terrific in counseling us in these areas. I don't think this is news, said that these numbers should also be viewed as the starting point for the FY16 budget. And given that the revenues are tight, in many cases, these are going to be the maximum numbers that we might expect to see in House 1 in these areas. I mean, one thing we were told yesterday is that there are concerns about the kindergarten grant. Overall, the feeling of some in the administration, we were told, is that there's additional monies available to school districts through Chapter 70 for full-day kindergarten, and so why should we also provide money through a kindergarten grant? Isn't that sort of, getting two bites at the apple? Those grants are intended to be short-term to incent to start classes and programs, so my reaction to that would be no, that they have two different purposes. Anyhow, we'll deal with that as we begin to see what House 1 looks like. But those are the kinds of reductions, as Mr. Rowe has laid out, that we believe we're looking at for the remainder of FY15. We have completed our staff and family surveys. We have somewhere in the neighborhood of a 61% response rate in terms of staff, and over 2,300 families responded, which would be somewhere in the neighborhood of a 47% response rate. We're very pleased in this initial year with the response rates. We expect to be able to publish district and school-based reports in mid-March. I have given you other information in the past of an earlier time frame But until we're able to sort of summarize comments and provide those in a report to principals that they can utilize in their work with school improvement plans, and until we can put the reports in a form that we would make public, it's going to take us a little bit of time. So we're shooting now for mid-March. The Deputy Town Administrator, as many of you know, Sean Cronin has accepted a position as Senior Deputy Commissioner of Local Services with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Well-deserved, tremendous loss for the town and selfishly for this school department, because Sean's been a great colleague and a great ally of our work, and we wish him well. He's going to a position where he will do great things for cities and towns across the Commonwealth, I'm certain. On Tuesday night, the town administrator announced the appointment of Melissa Goff as the Deputy Town Administrator, effective on February 20th upon Sean's departure. We've worked well with Melissa, and we're looking forward to working with her and helping her, supporting her in this new role as she takes over. The town administrator also announced that he would be conducting a search to fill the now vacant assistant town administrator position for as soon as possible, as we're about to proceed into budget season and a lot of work with the advisory committee that those two positions undertake. Some of you know Joe Campagna, who is our baseball coach and also was our assistant athletic director until his recent retirement. Recently, at the end of January, Joe was inducted into the Massachusetts Baseball Coaches Association Hall of Fame, and I saw some great pictures on Twitter and some other places of Joe with a significant number of players and former players who showed up at the dinner to honor him that night. He's a tremendous man and a terrific colleague, and a well-deserved honor for Joe based on his work. And the last piece of news I have on here has to do with the last 2 weeks and why I keep losing track of the days. We've been, as you know, not here on 4 days over the last 2 weeks. Did you know that, Ethan? Not 4 days. And we've canceled school for weather-related reasons over the last 2 weeks. Our school year, as of today, is now slated to end on Wednesday, June 24th. And it's February 5th. So we want to, I was working with Mrs. McHugh today to try to make sure that we could get an updated calendar and get that out to families. I think we might actually hold for a few days just to make sure that we're providing people with the most accurate information we can.
So that gives you, what, 4 more snow days to call?
I believe I have 4 more yet to call before, and I thank you for that. We were with the commissioner the other day. As many of you know, this commissioner has a very hard and fast line that he has taken on the 180 days. He reiterated that for the MASS officers the other day, even for those districts that have had 7 days out, and they exist now. And it fully expects that if districts don't wish to use days at the end of the year, that they will look at February and April vacations, and that only snow days past a certain date, I can't remember what the date is, I believe it's the end of March, days that we might be out would be considered for any kind of waiver. If you want to read more on this, I believe there's a 4 or 5 page paper that he has posted on the website on everything you wanted to know about the 180-day requirement and snow days. So, right, we have 4 left at the end of the year, and then we would need to look at whether we were going to go into July, which we may do, or whether we were going to begin to look at April vacation. Let's hope we don't have that conversation.
Excellent. No one wants that conversation. All right. Questions for the superintendent? Mr. Glover.
Thank you, Dr. Lupini and Madam Chair. With respect to the 9C cuts, do we have any sense at this point of when we might know the actual effect to our budget?
That's a good question. Mr. Rowe, when we will receive information from the department about district-by-district impact of the 9C cuts? Do you know?
My guess is we'll probably see something by the end of next week. I mean, we might even before. Usually they'll take those and they'll send us something in an advisory of some kind. Some may get more complicated. For instance, a METCO program that some of the money goes to Metro Central and then some goes to the districts. May take a little longer in doing something like that, but we should have a better ballpark information by the end of next week, I would think.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just clarify something just real quickly before I finish? That's fine, Mr. So my concern is more with accuracy of information. It's not with the governor's cuts. I get that the governor had to make proposals, had to balance a budget that he inherited, I'm not privy to all that information, but a number that they had to deal with. I'm more concerned about the media that continues to report that there's no impact on local aid, when in fact there is. There's a significant impact on local aid. And I sat with a number of colleagues from urban districts with the commissioner the other day that have a number of areas beyond those that we share in that they've had significant cuts in midway through the year. And yet the reporting is no cuts to local aid. And that's not accurate. Thanks.
So I think it'll just be helpful as we think about the second quarter report and we consider the fact that the 9C cuts affect us in this budget year, right? So that's why they're so concerning, how we think about that calibration. Because I think sometimes in the past, people look at our contingency line. There's been a robust discussion of our contingency line for some reason in town for the past few weeks. And what we do with all that money, it's like we spend it on teachers and kids. But anyway, the other thing we spend it on is when things go kind of the wrong way and we're not interested in, impacting staff and budgets halfway through a year. But if we're losing, what is it, $150,000, $200,000, $180,000 more or less, for this year that we are currently halfway through, that's why we have contingencies and why we can't cut it so close, as there are people in town who are interested in us doing. So it bears remembering as we proceed through the. Mr. Chang.
Quick question, Peter. The projected cut that you were referring to in its totality, is that for the remaining fiscal year or is that on an annualized basis?
That would be that'd be for the remaining of the year.
Wow.
So it's really, right, on an annualized basis, it would have twice the impact,
right.
really, because we have to take it out of the remainder of
Right.
the year.
All right.
Okay, on that cheery note. Snow days. Let's go back to snow days. Okay. Oh, you know what? We didn't mention Brookline Climate Change Week in the middle of all of this. It's not global warming, it's climate change, and the climate's changing. We've had historic snowfalls. Okay, thank you. So we have a school committee proposed action, agenda item number 6. A ratification of a one-year memorandum of agreement with the Brookline Educators Union, Unit A, B, and paraprofessionals. Ms. Stone, our negotiations chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On behalf of myself and Mr. Glover, I'm very pleased to bring these memorandum of agreement to the school committee. I want to thank everyone involved in reaching this agreement. First, the BEU, of course, and all the teachers and staff that ratified the agreement a week or so ago. Our negotiating team is Peter Rowe, Angela Allen, Mr. Glover, and myself, and of course, thanks to our Labor Counsel, Liz Valerio, who guides us through these. So this is, as the chair said, a one-year collective bargaining agreement. So we do have more work to do as we continue bargaining for a successor agreement, but it's great to have caught up at least, and it brings us through the year with an agreement in place, and that's terrific. As all of you know, the last collective bargaining agreement expired at the end of last August, so this will bring us up to date, which is a very good place to be. So there are 3 motions before us, one for each of the BEU's bargaining units, and we'll vote on each of them separately. And so I will take them in order. The first, to move to approve the memorandum of agreement with the Brookline Educators Union, Unit A, signed December 8th, 2014, and covering the period September 1st, 2014 until August 31st, 2015. Is there a second? Thank you, Mr. Chang. Are there any questions? All those in favor? That's unanimous. Thank you. Second, move to approve the memorandum of agreement with the Brookline Educators Union, Unit B, signed December 8th, 2014, and covering the period September 1st, 2014 until August 31st, 2015. Is there a second? Thank you, Mr. Chang. Any questions? Okay, all those in favor? That is unanimous. Thank you very much. And third and lastly, move to approve the memorandum of agreement with the Brookline Educators Union Paraprofessionals Unit, signed December 8th, 2014, and covering the period September 1st, 2014 until August 31st, 2015. Is there a second? Thank you. Ms. Gatto, are there any questions? All right, seeing none. All those in favor? It is unanimous. Thank you all.
Thank you, Ms. Stone. Thank you to the BEU. Thank you to all those involved in getting to a good agreement for this year. Clearly, there was no discussion at this point since it's all been discussed many, many times in executive session, so always feel the need to reiterate that. Our next agenda item is number 7, our FY15 second quarter financial report, the much anticipated and earlier foreshadowed formerly good news report.
Actually, today I've asked Mr. Rowe to pinch hit for me just because the last couple weeks my work has really precluded me from putting together some narrative around the Q2 results. But what I want to add, though, is that because of I think terrific planning on the part of administration, as well as continued efforts around managing our special ed outplacement programs, and as well as maintaining a steady pay rate for all our wonderful professionals. Our Q2 budget has come under initial targets. Unfortunately, obviously, we just heard the potential 9C cut is going to dent some of that, and which basically means that part of our rainy day fund will be depleted. But we'll get more, I guess, specificity in the next few days. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chang. And so to just to recap, what we're projecting in terms of spending on the budget for this year, we'll have an expenditure surplus in the neighborhood of $655,000. We are, however, down in our revenue projection. This is from the circuit breaker claim that we actually put in for a year ago, and because of the favorable reduction in the number of students we had in high-cost placements, it actually reduces some of the revenue. So that offsets some of this. So the net number is a surplus in the $500,000 range. And as Mr. Chang said, there are really two major areas. The most significant one is the reduction in the number of students in outside private placements, contracted services within special education. And so we'll see those numbers, and it continues the trend that we've experienced over the last couple of years that we believe is the result of some significant investment that the organization has put into strengthening the administration of the program, strengthening programs themselves, strengthening our processes and procedures, and good management and quality program building within the school system. The other piece is that our salary projection is on budget and then incorporates the projection for the contracts that you just approved. So looking forward for this year, we expect that applying that to the various salary totals will be just within our salary budget for the year. And this is, as you know, dealing with the staffing necessary this year for the elementary enrollment, which has continued at a significant pace. As you know, on October 1st, it was 684 students. So that looking on the right-hand side, you see that the numbers that add up to that 655,000, the big one is under services, that's 489,000, and that's really the savings in our contracted services line. We're virtually on budget at the 62,000 positive number on our total salary budget. So that's essentially coming in on budget, and then the 89,000 is remaining contingency we have. So as we go forward, as I said earlier, and as you also said, as we have to deal with the 9C cuts, we'll see what impact they'll have on our remaining contingency and other issues. And finally, the bottom line that shows under circuit breaker funds is the $146,000 is the negative actual at where we expect to receive $1.7 million in circuit breaker revenue this year against the original budget number of $1.9 million, which is what we had put together last spring last February as we were putting this budget together. So so that they net out to approximately a $500,000 savings for this year. And as you recall, we budgeted under the other revenue number $1,083,000 from reserve. So essentially what that means is we can take approximately half of that reserve that we put into the budget, and we'll have that, if we can hold the line on this, available as we look forward to building the FY16 budget. Just to show the significance of the numbers, this year, FY15, putting in perspective, you notice our current count of students in private placements is 59. And so that's a significant reduction, and it shows the trend downward. And that's the same number that we presented to you at the first quarter. So we've held the line. We do, however, have some unilateral replacements that the department is negotiating with families around placements and those issues. So that one thing we have done in this projection is incorporated approximately $400,000 of reserves for committed to those yet unresolved issues. So we expect that this number will hold pretty close to this through the end of the year.
Those four would be up from the 59?
Those would be numbers in addition to 59, that's correct. So we're reserving dollars so that the 5.9 is not exclusively for the 59. In fact, the total committed for the actual placements would be more in the, $4.5 million range, because the way the numbers work, we have about $1 million worth of what we call ancillary services, in other words, contracts for support services, some of which are provided for, in fact, most of which are provided for students who are being served in district to supplement services of a whole host of areas. And then we have a reserve for about $400,000 within that. So that's the total that we're projecting. Just to quickly review, this is the enrollment growth that we've experienced. You all are quite aware of this pattern, and it's what we live every day. And this shows you the growth of almost 1,500 student growth at the 8 elementary schools since the FY05 experience. You notice in that year we had 3 schools that were in the 300s in terms of actual enrollment. So those days are, as you know, past. And what we're continuously trying to remind the community is that we have to be anticipating the movement of the higher classes through the system each year as enrollment growth really happens as a result of large incoming kindergartens and then existing cohorts moving forward as we graduate the smaller groups of students, so that the top 5 classes this year, 8th grade through 12th grade, average 480 students, but our bottom 5 average 630 students. So that's really the significance of the pressure in the system. These are our average class sizes. We've worked very hard, as you all know, to keep those numbers as low as possible, but it has been a struggle during this period of time. And I wanted to go back to those if you want me to. One thing I did want to speak to in special education, you notice, well, it's not just special education. In a mix of our services of providing an aid in every first grade and kindergarten, as well as our special education services, it's because we've struggled over the last few years with the Wheelock internship program. We've actually increased some of our first grade aides. So that's contributed some toward the growth of our total aid population. We're at a high level compared back to the last 6 or 7 years. But we believe that we've gotten significant program quality out of that assignment of aides to classrooms, as opposed to moving to that program model away from the one-on-one based model. And finally, on this graph, if you look at the last column to the right, what you see is a 5-year pattern where the growth of our special education program costs, and this is just direct special education, has really been in line with the total budget. In fact, in a couple of these years, and this year in particular, it's actually less than the growth of the total budget. So after a number of years of struggling with some high costs, through the actions that have been taken in terms of creating many of these in-house programs, as well as other changes in practice, we have stabilized for this period of time, at least some of the costs of these high-cost services. Looking forward, obviously, it'll continue to be an area where we have to be mindful of balancing the appropriate level of service to the student population, but at least we've been successful over the last few years in keeping it consistent with our total budget growth. So I'm glad to answer any questions.
All right, questions for Mr. Rowe? Dr. Jackson?
I have a question, and it may not be for you, Mr. Rowe, but it relates to the topic of the WELAC interns and the aides.
Yeah.
We've talked about it several times in our finance conversations, and I'm curious if we are exploring other options, since that option doesn't seem to be as viable and we've had to make these adjustments, or is it that we're now at a place where we say, maybe we just need to hire and not go through universities or education partnerships? I'm just curious about that in terms of the impact on our budget, but also program.
It's a great question. The advantage of this particular program is the license that students are working toward. They're working toward a combined elementary and special education license, which is a huge advantage to them and a huge advantage to us. And so we were in on the ground floor of this program. They've not been able to attract the numbers that they've been looking for. We continue to try to work with them around helping with those issues. But over the last couple of years, we have other internship programs, not specific to the K-1 issue. Over the last couple of years, Dr. Allen has had a number of meetings at a number of other universities with similar programs, not identical in terms of that license, and attempting to bring in others to this program, or to our, quite frankly, to our program in general. We've had some success with that, but not where we want to be yet. Not that that's not going to happen, but in some of those other programs, we're in competition with other districts, and we're having to look at the stipend that we provide, and whether that stipend meets the numbers that some of the other school districts that work with some of those other universities spend. So we'd like to expand this concept, but there's an appropriate balance. There's also this funny other interactive piece, which is the qualifications of being able to take an intern. So you have to have a certain number of years in the classroom to be able to do that. And, we've had some turnover associated with retirements, and we've added sections. And this is where we've added the sections. And so a number of those people haven't met that minimum qualification. And so from year to year, sometimes it's been WELAC and other partners, and sometimes it's been us. So, and that's going to continue to be a struggle for us, maybe less so now that we seem to have the number of sections right at K and 1, right? Unless we end up larger than we are now. Yes, so all of those pieces go into a very good question with a very complicated answer, right?
Very helpful.
Thanks.
Voted Dr. Lupini jinxed our kindergarten numbers. Ms. Stone?
Well, if we keep on having snow days on registration days.
That'll take care of it.
Mr. Rowe, I had a pretty straightforward question about the cost of the number of out-of-district placements. I noticed that, that this year, with our incredibly low number of 59 students, the cost is the same as fiscal '07 when we had 79 students. And I'm just curious, we talk a lot with our legislators about the out-of-district tuitions and increases, and I'm just curious if we know what the breakdown is between FY '07 and fiscal '15. That doesn't look to me like real dollars in terms of, right, a difference just in the real dollars. So the question is,
Yeah.
is it because tuitions have gone up?
That's certainly some of it. It's not exclusively that. The ancillary services piece that I referenced is in that total number, so that this is a private placement and those other services we contract for. An example might be, we contract for nursing services at some years for complex students. Another year, we might have an in-house person who provides that service. We have, at different times, provided home-based service tutoring through contract, where now we do more of it in-house. We've had BCBA service through contract. So each of these years has had various, if you will, levels of noise and change over time. The most significant piece behind any of these is, in fact, the cost of the private school that the placement is made at. The other thing is, it also has to do with the mix of students. Some are students who are students with a very high level of need, and they may be in a school that has a cost that that's higher, and we may have a few of those kids in any one year. So your specific point, though, is correct, that over this period of time, certainly the unit cost on any given school has risen during that period of time, and it is something that we continue to advocate with the state that tends to control those, in terms of the extent that they can try to keep that under control, separate from the restructuring that often they'll do.
Yeah, the interesting, I mean, we've been through some of this, right? So the interesting sort of impact, when you look at '07 into '08, that was largely about aging out, right? That 1 year dip, which we talked a lot about when that happened in terms of that budget, that was an aging out issue. Not really driven by, and we had lots of other things that we talked about and looked at, but really it was about some students, some number of students in some very, very complicated placements, therefore very expensive, who aged out, right? And so this is an area where one student in a particular high-cost program, when they age out, you could actually see it in the budget, and possibly draw some conclusions that actually aren't there about your numbers.
And if I can just, another area that I think your point helps to underscore is the issue of, how we have, over the last number of years, had reserves that we could bring to the table. We talked about fund balance. If you actually look at the 2 years, first, the one that the superintendent was just speaking of, which is where we had, from '07 to '08, a significant drop from 79 to 68, yet the state funding, which is the column to the far right, stayed essentially the same at $2 million. We had effectively budgeted for the full amount, but had a number of age outs so that we had a surplus in that account for that year. The other year in which it happened was in '04 to '05. You notice how the state funding circuit breaker grew from $1 million to $1.8 million. That was a year in which the state increased, very late in the process, circuit breaker funding. We'd budgeted based on receiving only $1 million. When we got the $1.8 million for that year, because our total cost didn't rise significantly, we were able to, if you will, establish a fund balance. And it was between those 2 years that we were able to establish this fund balance that we've then been able to look at as a reserve, because we're allowed to carry those dollars forward. You use 1 year to fund your next. And so it's given us some flexibility in terms of budgeting that we've managed to take advantage of. So,
Thank you for the wealth of information in response to the question. Mr. Rogers was talking earlier about, what was it, visualizing your thinking, or part of habits of mind? And I was just, since we do talk to the legislators, the legislators, and they're often asking us for representation of how we feel the changes that we're talking about and the problems, and I just thought that that comparison between fiscal '07 and fiscal '15, with such a dramatic drop in the numbers of students, but no real change in the two in terms of the cost to the system, that's a really stark representation of what we're talking about when we talk about the rapidly rising cost of providing the services that we provide. So, thank you for that.
And just if I can on this point, just to relate this back to the earlier conversation about 9C cuts, I saw this the other day when there was the second reduction in circuit breaker this year, albeit $250,000. That's largely going to be administrative costs at the department level. This state is still near the bottom in the country in its funding of special education. Even with the changes to circuit breaker, which have been well received, great program in terms of its structure, based on what we used to have, the 50-50 on high, what was it, high 50-50, Peter, on high-cost residentials, those, so that.
Right.
So this is a much better program. The fact of the matter is the dollars put towards special education are still near the bottom of the country.
It's ironic, given that Massachusetts has a reputation for such great special
Yes.
education.
Mr. Lepsky.
And then on top of that, no good deed goes unpunished. I expect that next year, our reimbursement from the state, based on
We're
the
already
59,
budgeted for a decrease,
will-
yes.
will be less, probably closer to 1 million.
Yes.
You're correct, that number's going to go down. We're still working on trying to determine what the number is that we should be building FY16 on.
All right. But that number going down is a good thing. It means we're spending,
Well, yes.
potentially.
It means we're spending less, which is good.
Right. Sometimes if your income goes up, you pay more taxes. That's a good thing.
Right.
So let's just be clear. Okay. We are within striking distance of ending within 10% of our scheduled end time, unless there are further questions, despite our overly long executive session.
Thank you, Mr. Rowe. Nice job.
Otherwise, if there's no new business.
Your budget transfers.
Budget transfers. Mr. Chang, do you have language for us?
We had,
Or do we?
I thought we had the attachment.
There's
What
attachment
they
here.
Is it in here? I don't know if it's in here.
Yes, yeah.
I think it was an attachment to our email. Do you have the language, Mr. Lepsky?
In just a moment. Oh, no.
What would happen if we vote budget transfers in 7 days and not
That would
tonight?
be excellent.
All right.
Yes.
We will get the language, we will vote in 7 days, and the world will continue to spin on its axis. It's very exciting. If there is no new business, we are adjourned.
Thank you.
Susan?